Hello and welcome to Welty at Home. This is the slow reading virtual book club that alternates works by Eudora Welty with works by authors who are connected to Welty in some way. We are currently reading and discussing To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. Today's discussion will focus on The Window, sections 6 through 10. I'm Jessica Russell, director of the Eudora Welty House and Garden, and for this series, we are joined by our guest moderator, Virginia Woolf scholar Susan Harrison. She's the Eckerd Professor of Rhetoric and author of Eudora Welty and Virginia Woolf, Gender, Genre, and Influence. Susan will be co-leading discussions with Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend and biographer, professor emerita of Millsaps College, and a fixture of Welty at Home. Just some housekeeping. To comment or ask a question, be sure to click the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a tablet or phone, you may have to tap to have that function appear for you. And be sure to keep an eye on the chat. There's a lively discussion that usually takes place in the chat. Be sure to glance over at that every now and then. We appreciate all the comments and links that go on there. And now, Susan, shall we officially begin our discussion of To the Lighthouse?
I think that sounds great.
All
Certainly
right.
we should. So welcome, everyone. It is such a treat to be here again this week. I've spent a lot of time in the past week thinking over comments, thinking over observations that folks made. So I'm really looking forward to today. And now that we've gotten a little further into the novel, I want to start us out in one direction, but of course, we will go in, I'm sure, a number of different directions today. But it's clear once we get through the first 10 sections that the window section of the novel includes a contemplation on or an exploration of marriage. We have Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay sitting at the center of a group of characters without partners. I mean, we have Lily Briscoe, we have Mr. Banks, Lily Briscoe, who's not married in spite of Mrs. Ramsay's encouragement, Mr. Banks, whose wife has died. We have Augustus Carmichael, whose wife has treated him horribly, according to Mrs. Ramsay. We have Charles Tansley, who is, who Mrs. Ramsay, I think it's later on, thinks that not until he has a position and a wife will he become really a tolerable person. And then we have Paul and Menta, who are really kind of standing perhaps on the cusp of marriage, but who aren't married. So I would like to start by some discussion about what kinds of perspectives or questions does Woolf explore about marriage in the window section so far?
Can we get a first response? Anyone want to venture in?
And if I've asked a dud of a question, we can move on. I have lots of others.
There's Harriet and Beverly.
Okay. Harriet.
Okay, so I'm in an unusual spot today. I'm in Chicago, so I'm hoping you can hear me. Yeah, I've been thinking about marriage. I've been thinking about the kind of juxtaposition of two goals, academic goals. I'm thinking about the satire of academics, and then I'm thinking about the satire of marriage. And, you know, I'm thinking about Lily's feeling that Mrs. Ramsay is high-handed because she thinks that everyone should be married, all young girls should be married, and Lily dares to think there is her painting if she should dare to say so as an alternative. But I'm also thinking about the fact that Mrs. Ramsay is sitting there reading The Fisherman and His Wife to James, and the idea of if I won't get the line exactly right, but of a wife who wills what I do not will, and of having different goals. I'm thinking about marriage and femaleness and female goals, but I'm also thinking about beauty. and the way this novel treats beauty. But I'll just raise those as things we could talk about because there are other hands up.
I love I'm so glad you mentioned beauty, because that, I mean, Mrs. Ramsey's beauty plays such a central role in this novel.
It does. And it is this, is this kind of, it's a way of being seen.
Yeah.
It keeps you from being seen. But yeah, enough for me.
All right, Beverly.
Well, I would say that Virginia Woolf's not a fan of marriage. I mean, that's, you know, from what we've seen so far, we're not getting a very good picture. Not, you know, Ms. Ramsey's relationship with Mr. Ramsey, the other characters' relationships, the relationship within the family where James hates his father. I mean, it's, you know, there is a lot of unhappiness with, and Ms. Ramsey, even though she's unhappy too, and we see her fluctuate about how she feels about her husband, and but she's still going to push marriage on Minta and Lily if possible. But I think Virginia Woolf is not a fan.
And certainly Virginia Woolf's marriage was a complicated, certainly a complicated one. But you know that there is that interesting connection of her wanting to push marriage on others as a way of justifying the choices she's made of the life that she has. Monica.
Well, it's been a while since I've read this, and I think in my past readings, I missed the humor in it because reading it this time, Mr. Ramsey cracks me up. I mean, that satirical portrait of him walking the, that he requires sympathy and whiskey and someone to tell the story of his suffering too at once. This whole section, both of them are satirized, but yet there's some sympathy for Mrs. Ramsey, I think, where, you know, you get the description of her folding in on herself, you know, in the face of his suffering and need and all of that, it's both the humor and the sympathy for Mrs. Ramsey that really struck me in this section.
Okay. Marcia.
Well, I want to go back to something that's in the very first section where talking about Mrs. Ramsey is trying to get her daughters to behave properly to Charles Tansley. And this section, her daughters, Prue, Nancy, Rose, could sport with infidel ideas, which they had brewed for themselves of a life different from hers, in Paris perhaps, a wilder life, not always taking care of some man or other. For there was in all their minds a mute question of deference and chivalry of the Bank of England and the Indian Empire. Again, I love the humorous confluence of those things put together. But that must have been the way Vanessa and Virginia in that household thought of things. They didn't necessarily think I'll never marry, but they must have seen how their mother was subordinate to their father and really a servant to him. And they must have thought, we want something different. And then as soon as their father died, they got it. So I see both the characterization here of Mrs. Ramsey vis-a-vis her daughters and the biographical aspect.
Jessica.
I just didn't want to leave the discussion of portraits of marriage without mentioning a little humorous moment. Monica was pointing out some of Mrs. Ramsey's humor, but I really enjoyed her comment about Minta's parents as Poker and the Owl.
Right. It's another example of a variation of marriage that is very funny, but is certainly not warm and positive. And yet, there's a connection between Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, that even though we find him to be humorous, and before we started, Suzanne and I were talking about the fact that, if you spent much time in academia, you recognize Mr. Ramsey. He seems quite familiar, but there are moments of genuine connection that seem very meaningful. Pearl.
Sorry, I just came in from gardening. So things look. I was really struck with this beautiful practice of slow reading that we've been doing now, to recognize the style that she's writing in, and how, wait, this is the modernist style that I had absolutely, unfortunately, taken for granted for a while now. But in section 6, when it starts out, and I'm on page 31, there's quotation marks around what Mr. Ramsey says, but then she was trying to get these tiresome stockings finished, said Mrs. Ramsey, without the quotation. So I'm reading and I'm thinking, okay, well, this is all in Mrs. Ramsey's interior monologue, right? Thinking about that. But then over on page 33, when she starts talking about, it was a splendid mind, or if is like the keyboard of a piano, divided so many notes, or like the alphabet is ranged in 26 letters, and so on and so forth. I mean, one, she uses these beautiful epic similes that just carry you into some other world. But is that still in Mrs. Ramsey's mind, or are we out of it? I mean, and if it is in Mrs. Ramsey's mind, which I really want it to be, how brilliant of her to analyze her husband. And that's what she seems to be struggling with, and what I think the marriage is struggling with. She's asked later, is this love? Is love the thing? But she knows him so well, she can know what he's thinking and how he gets stuck on Q and he wants to move forward to R. I mean, tell me, is that Mrs. Ramsey thinking or what?
I've always assumed it was Mrs. Ramsey thinking.
Okay.
Any other thoughts on that?
I did not think it was Mrs. Ramsey.
Who did you think it
thought it
was?
might have been Mr. Ramsey himself. Got his brilliant mind.
But there's
Certainly is later in the paragraph.
Is his, yeah.
It's him in mid-paragraph for sure.
I think you're right. Because in the paragraph before, it is Mr. Ramsey.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's Mr. Ramsey. And I think that what strikes me as, amazing about this novel is the shift of point of view in the middle of a paragraph, but yeah, I think we've shifted into Mr. Ramsey, but there's just enough ambiguity about it that we're in the Ramseys.
Right. And I think that it does get at one of the kind of crises within the marriage at the moment in which the novel's set, or when this section is set, is that recognition that his last book was not his finest, that he's reached the pinnacle of his intellectual career and is now on the downward slide. And so probably isn't going to get any further to
Yeah, if it is Mrs. Ramsey thinking, to me, that is even more brilliant, because she knows her husband so well. She can be in her mind, sort of like the little game you play. Well, I won't ask this because then he'll say that. And if he says that, then I'll say this. And how you project forward. But she knows him so well. She's maybe he has said all of this and she's running it through her mind again.
Mhm.
I don't know. I want it to be Mrs. Ramsey, knowing her husband.
All right, Joellen.
I want to offer third alternative. It strikes me as very like Jane Austen, slipping in and out of characters' minds. We have a narratorial voice. And toward the top of page 34, 6th or 7th line down, we get, after here at least was Q, he dug his heels in at Q. That sounds almost like, an external voice commenting. And then if you move toward the center of the page, a shudder, like the leathern eyelid of a lizard, flickered over the intensity of his gaze. That's not Mrs. Ramsey, and it's probably not Mr. Ramsey. So there's another voice in here
Oh, I
moderating.
love that lizard. I love that lizard.
Yeah.
That's just amazing. But I think you're right. I think that, that's not, it is a narrator's description of Mr. Ramsey's experience at that moment. Harriet.
I didn't know I had my hand up.
Oh,
But
I'm sorry.
yeah. I would just argue again for the Ramseys that we're in between them, and their thoughts are merged in the paragraph or in the section in the way that they are merging in this room. Yeah.
Kind of intentional ambiguity.
Yeah.
And so so the Ramseys are one example, one part of that kind of exploration of marriage. But Lily Briscoe has a very, very different view of marriage. And it's one that, it's one that is interesting given her relationship with Mrs. Ramsey. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. But Joellen, you still have your hand up.
We're not hearing you, Joellen.
Sorry. This really is a step back, and I'm sorry, then I'm not
That's
going to talk
okay.
about Lily Briscoe. But another thing I would say on page 34 that suggests the narratorial voice is the humor with the letters, the
Right.
Q's, the R's. I don't think that sounds entirely like either one of them. And
Yeah.
after the first paragraph at the top of the page, then R, he braced himself, but then we get Q, qualities, at the beginning of the first sentence, and R at the end of the last sentence in the paragraph. R for Ramsey. But then, and at the end of the paragraph beginning a shudder, he would never reach R. On to R once more, and once more into the breach. We've got the charge of the light brigade again, but
Right.
R dash. There's an outside humorous perspective in here, it seems to me.
And I had never noticed that play with the word qualities there. I love that. So Cheryl.
Okay, so this is the reason that I have so much fun with this book club is because of all the things that I learned. So with Pride and Prejudice, we covered free and direct discourse, and now we're discussing, like Marcia Huff last week was talking about an objective narrator, and then Patricia in the chat is saying something about an omniscient narrator. So now I have to look all that stuff up. But so emotional intimacy, there is and Mrs. Ramsey is continuously paired physically with the youngest child, who is a boy, James. And so emotional intimacy with her children, specifically James, but also with her husband. Going to the end of part 5, knowing she smoothed James's hair, and she sought to comfort him by finding just the right photo drawing that she knew that he would want to cut out. And so transferring that emotional intimacy into the romantic marriage realm, that's how she knows someone had blundered. And I don't know who says, but what had happened, I think it's still her. And she knows that someone had blundered because she is intuitively picking up on Mr. Ramsey's shivering and quivering. That she knows that something has happened.
Right. All his satisfaction in his own splendor. I love that. Just that phrase is so wonderful. Well, so Lily Briscoe is convinced, it seems to me, that getting married really eliminates the possibility of being an artist. That she doesn't want to get married. And I'm sorry, where's my list of page numbers? I think it's on page 49 or 40. Hold on one second. There's the scene, yes, on page 50, a scene that I'm just fascinated by, where Lily Briscoe is lying with her head in Mrs. Ramsey's lap and laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed, almost hysterically, at the thought of Mrs. Ramsey presiding with immutable calm over destinies which she completely failed to understand. There she sat, simple, serious. She had recovered her sense of her now. This was the glove's twisted finger. But into what sanctuary had one penetrated? Lily Briscoe had looked up at last, and there was Mrs. Ramsey, unwitting entirely what had caused her laughter, still presiding, but now with every trace of willfulness abolished, and in its stead, something clear as the space which the clouds at last uncover, the little space of sky which sleeps beside the moon. I mean, so why is Lily laughing hysterically? What do you make of that scene where, it follows right on. Lily would say there was her father, her home, even had she dared to say it, her painting. But all this seems so little, so virginal against the other. So thoughts about Lily Briscoe and her hysterical laughter and that relationship between marriage and art. Yes, sorry, Cheryl.
I'll go. I'm not 100% ready. I just didn't want the dead air. But this is back to our reading last week, and the depiction of Lily's making the doing the painting and the specific colors that were used. For instance, the purple and white before she and Mr. Banks go for a walk, and the beautiful blues, and the seeing the colors first, and then the action comes with it.
Mhm.
That's it.
Okay, Beverly. Wait, no, yes. Beverly.
I think I read that Lily Briscoe's 33,
Mhm.
right? So she would be an old maid during this time, really. And but we see page 48 when she's thinking about her painting, and she said, Mr. Tansley whispering in her ear, women can't paint, women can't write.
Right.
And so, and if she does marry and she has somebody in control of her life, to the degree that she probably would have, then her artistic desires, that romantic part of her that she expresses through her art, would be tamped down. It would be lost to her probably. And she's made it this far without getting married.
Living on the old Brompton Road. Harriet.
I wouldn't mind living on the old Brompton
I
Road.
wouldn't either. It'd be one of my choices, in fact.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking about the doubleness of satire in this book, where let me flip back to academics for a minute, and to he worked hard, 7 hours a day. The subject was the influence of something upon somebody, or Mr. Tansley has to go in now and write his dissertation. That's one presentation of academics. But the other one, I think that Mr. Ramsey is allowed a certain stature, thinking about the nature of things, and I think that doubleness is also there for marriage. That
Right.
marriage is, on the one hand, is a reductive thing that is an impediment to intimacy. The kind of self-exposure that Lily is trying for in her art.
Right.
But it also is pictured as a kind of intimacy and exposure, that people looking at the Ramsays and saying, this is so attractive that I'm in love with Mrs. Ramsay. This idea of love and family and of connectedness is so appealing that that everybody seems to be in love with Mrs. Ramsay as with their own kind of approach to intimacy.
Mhm.
And Lily too. I mean, Lily is
Definitely.
in love with them or Mrs. Ramsay. She's not quite sure which, but she is also talking about what is she, if she loves her, does she know her? Is she intimate with her? And so it's a doubleness that has to do with the way in which Woolf uses her humor, I think.
And
She wants
it's
love,
clear-
but not separateness.
Right.
And she wants union with Mrs. Ramsay's mind.
Right.
Immediately after laughing at her presumptiveness.
Right, and yet it's clear that Mrs. Ramsay does not understand Lily.
Right.
That there's that understand as much as Lily has that yearning for that union, that connection with Mrs. Ramsay. Mrs. Ramsay, it's not reciprocated.
You couldn't take, Mrs. Ramsay thinks you couldn't take her painting seriously.
Right, right.
Or she thinks that she was such a brisk fool. Yeah.
Right, right. So, and you have, you also have you made me think of Mr. Banks and his infatuation with Mrs. Ramsay, that kind of connection he feels. And you have Mrs. Ramsay saying, oh, Lily and Charles Banks must marry. So there's the humor. I confess, I see the humor more this time than ever before, which I'm just so enjoying. Monica.
Well, I'm enjoying watching Lily kind of tease out these things that to her are tangled up. And when I'm looking at it, the wording is so important because first, right, just after the passage you read on page 51, first she says it's not knowledge, but unity she desired.
Right.
Nothing that could be written in any language known to men, right? So that's gendered there. But then she says intimacy is knowledge. And then she says that she's, asks, and how then she had to ask, she asks herself, she doesn't ask anybody out there, how did one know one thing or another thing about people sealed as they word? And then it's the next page on 53 when she's trying to explain things. She could not show him what she wished to make of it, could not even see it herself without a brush in her hand. So I think the brush in her hand here is like really central to this trying to untangle intimacy and knowledge here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I also loved it on 51, where Lily is asking herself the question, what art was there known to love or cunning, by which one pressed through into those secret chambers? And I think the word art is used so intentionally there in Lily's thinking about this. And we have, it is in some ways a moment of little tragedy where she has She says, for it was not knowledge, but unity that she desired, not inscriptions on tablets, nothing that could be written in any language known to men, but intimacy itself, which is knowledge. She had thought, leaning her head on Mrs. Ramsay's knee. Nothing happened. Nothing, nothing, as she leant her head against Mrs. Ramsay's knee. So that sense of desire that is not fulfilled. Marcia.
Well, at the end of that section, Lily comes to a different illumination. You have, she's thinking about how wonderful she can thank Mr. Ramsay for being here for this time she has. She can thank Mrs. Ramsay. And she's experiencing a power which she had not suspected, that one could walk away down the long gallery, not alone anymore, but arm in arm with somebody. The strangest feeling in the world and the most exhilarating. And then she closes her box. She has a sense of connection, which is not the same as marital love, but it's at least her experience of connection through her art, because it was with Mr. Banks that she was discussing her art that she felt this connection.
What did you make of the, she nicked the catch of her paint box too, more firmly than was necessary. I just love that. And then the nick itself seems to surround her.
Yeah, it surrounds in a circle forever. She's a visual person. Mm-hmm. She not only there's the nick of the paint box, we hear it, but to her it's visual. The nick seemed to surround in a circle forever, the paint box, the lawn, Mr. Banks, and that wild villain Cam, and that we have Cam coming, the transition to the next section. Right. But of everything she does, everything she sees is visual. It's like when she says that Mrs. Ramsay becomes the shape of a dome, because she has the idea of the bee going from place to place, which is also very much an image of connection. And there's the place where she wouldn't change it. It's something about a shaft of light on the floor. She sees things, she sees the world and actually translate concepts like connection, affection, love into visual images. And Virginia Woolf just is a master at that. She can take the most abstract idea and give you an image that makes it clear.
Mm-hmm. And it is interesting that her sister is a painter. And so,
very much. There's no accident there.
Yes, it's wonderful. Jo Ellen.
Thanks. I too wanted to go back to that very paragraph at the end of page 51 that Marcia's been discussing, because it begins, nothing happened, nothing, which we've heard. Then the next sentence begins, and yet. Yep. Knowledge and wisdom were stored up. Then that wonderful bee image. This whole paragraph reminded me of James's vision on page 1, where, and I quote, almost quote, but any change of sensation, any turn of the wheel, and changes and turns are throughout this section we read for today. But any turn of the wheel has the power to crystallize and transfix the moment. So it's visual, but it's time stopped into a moment as well. And then on page 51 again, when she's described the bee drawn by some sweetness or something intangible to taste, you're left with at the bottom, for days there hung about her, as after a dream of some subtle change is felt in the person one has dreamt of, more vividly than anything, she said, the sound of murmuring. And as she sat, anyway, the sound of murmuring, there's something, it's like that dream. It can hardly be touched, it's momentary. And I think almost any vision of unity or union is like that.
Right. It's temporary and something that you can't hold on to.
One last thing. I was just commenting on the dome, the shape of a dome. It had a ring for me, so I checked. Biblically, a dome, God creates a dome to separate the two kinds of waters into the primal sea and the upper, so that the land could appear. So a dome, I think, has much more resonance than we might discover along. Sorry.
Pearl?
In several things leading up to that nicking of the box and closing the paint box. On 51, the one sentence nobody read yet was, how then, she had asked herself, did one know one thing or another thing about people, sealed as they were? And there's the paint box being sealed. And then on 53, when she's describing her art to Mr. Banks, it seems to me that this description is a description of modern art, in that what you see is not what you paint. I mean, what's physically, realistically there is not what you paint. If we all paint a picture of the side of a barn, it all looks different on our canvases. And I'm keyed in here, of course, to Welty, also at the top of page 53, a light here required a shadow there. And she's able to explain why she uses these shapes, why she uses the light and the shadow, why she uses the lines. And at the end of that paragraph, she says, she might do it by bringing the line of the branch across or break the vacancy in the foreground by an object, James perhaps. But the danger was that by doing that, the unity of the whole might be broken. And to the unexperienced eye, maybe Mr. Banks's eye even, it doesn't look unified at all, but she knows what would be unity in her painting. So when she closes the box, nick the catch, the nick seemed to surround in the circle forever. I think she's trying to hold her understanding of what she had painted. Having explained it, then she understands it even more. What she maybe intuited, now maybe she knows a little bit better. So she closes the box to hold that thought. Just my idea.
And it's really, I love the next paragraph at the bottom of the page, but it had been seen. It had been taken from her. This man had shared with her something profoundly intimate, and thanking Mr. Ramsay for it and Mrs. Ramsay for it, and the hour and the place, crediting the world with the power which she had not suspected. And then we go into the walk down the long gallery, but that sense of, sharing, that to gain that intimacy is also a loss of some sort, I think is very resonant. Harriet.
Yeah, I want to talk about exposure, maybe across Woolf and Welty, having written a book about exposure in Eudora Welty. The passage I'm reading is, she would have snatched her picture off the easel, but she said to herself, one must. She braced herself to stand the awful trial of someone looking at her picture. One must, she said, one must. And then that any other eyes should see the residue of her 33 years, the deposit of each day's living mixed with something more secret than she had ever spoken or shown in the course of all those days, was an agony. At the same time, it was immensely exciting. But, I'm thinking about skipping ahead to Lily's painting had been seen, it had been taken from her. This man had shared with her something profoundly intimate, exposure, self-exposure. And I'm thinking about my interest in all of those scenes of exposure in Welty's work where women expose themselves and are beyond what's ladylike and are stared at by narrators who are considering escaping ladyhood. But I'm also thinking about Welty writing that of her need for exposure to the world and the terrible sense of exposure that she feels with every book when she suddenly sees her words with the cold eyes of the public. It gives me a terrible sense of exposure, she says, as if I'd gotten sunburned. That exposure is a process that begins in intuition and has its end in knowing that the heart that expected while it dreads that exposure. Exposure is both a word that she uses to describe vulnerability, but also a dreaded vulnerability, as well as a writer's goal. This uneasy anxiety of authorship, of exposure, of artistic bearing, of being too exposed, of being inappropriately seen, as strikes me as something that is right across Welty and Woolf.
And for Woolf, I mean, the publication of each novel, I mean, almost each time led to one of her breakdowns. And it was that absolute fear of sharing this with the world. And so much so that, you know, others, I mean, her husband, Leonard Woolf, tried to persuade her not to write, you know, to stop putting herself through this. But I mean, it was clearly, it was something she couldn't stop. And yet it was so painful and created such vulnerability for her. And the marriage, you know, when we think about marriage and we think about Woolf, you know, for Woolf, marriage was both protection and imprisonment, and intimacy, but with Virginia and Leonard Woolf, not necessarily physical intimacy. So it just, marriage, I think, marriage in all of Woolf's novels is so complicated. And I think for very good reason, given Woolf's history, but that vulnerability of the artist, and that tremendous fear, and yet a compelling need to share that vision, I think is something that is treated in such complicated ways in this novel, and really tied to the issues of being a woman artist in this novel. Monica.
You know, I hadn't thought about it till just now, but we're getting this really incredible and also satirical contrast between Lily Briscoe's art and Mrs. Ramsey's helping James cut out the pictures from the catalog of the refrigerator and all of that stuff that I hadn't realized. But and I just looking at what we're starting for the next section, she's also like, after we see Lily Briscoe, then we see Mrs. Ramsey with the picture of the refrigerator. So it's an interesting commentary on, you know, what marriage does to art.
And Mrs. Ramsey is knitting throughout, and the knitting, you know, doesn't get done. It doesn't get completed. And so I think that that's another piece of it. And then I think later on we see more of Mrs. Ramsey as an artist in some later sections of the window. But I think also throughout, at least as far as we've come also, and this gets back to Mrs. Ramsey's beauty, but you have multiple characters looking at a mother reading to a son in the window. That's what Lily's painting. We have Mr. Banks looking at it and radiantly. I mean, he's just infatuated. And it's part of what Mr. Ramsey is looking at in his desire for comfort and whiskey, and, you know, a sense he wants Mrs. Ramsey to bring into being the setting of the home that assuages his soul. So, you know, but it's very interesting that she is Mrs. Ramsey is the subject of vision, of all of these different visions in this section. Pearl.
I liked how you started last week talking about the biographical aspects of it, in setting, especially in the Virginia's childhood. But then there's so much interwoven. You were just talking about her marriage and her view of men, and especially of Leonard, having, building the press, but then it's Leonard's press and Leonard writing and so on and so forth like that. And then on this is in section 8 on page 45. I believe I'm all confused now about who's speaking, but Ramsey, she says about Mr. Ramsey, it was a disguise, the middle of just toward the top of the page. It was a disguise. It was the refuge of a man afraid to own his own feelings, who could not say, this is what I like, this is what I am, and rather pitiable and distasteful to William Banks and Lily Briscoe, who wondered why such concealment should be necessary, why he needed always praise, why so brave a man in thought should be so timid in life, how strangely he was venerable and laughable at one and the same time. And if you put that together with her own doubts, and then she's reading this fairy tale, which is also the fairy tale that Eudora Welty cites.
Yes.
In Fairy Tale on Nature's Trace, which is about the powers that are shared there. Although I don't like the term, I began to feel that Mrs. Ramsey is suffering from, and maybe Mr. Ramsey too, of the imposter syndrome. I mean, I don't like that term because it's very misogynistic. I mean, the men made it up kind of thing about the women. But it's like nobody really knows or accepts their strengths. And if they do, then they're doubted. And that's like Virginia Woolf herself, I think, are these books her children? She's got these 8 children with Mrs. Ramsey. Half of them are half brothers and sisters, older, younger, mothering, not mothering. It's so beautiful. Sorry, I don't have a question.
Suzanne,
I have a question. This is the place for my question.
It is. It's perfect.
I've been wondering about the Michelangelo on the wall, the authenticated Michelangelo, and what's its purpose in the novel? Why is this mentioned? And I think it goes to what Pearl was talking about there, this question of authenticity of characterization, or the characters questioning their own authenticity. So Susan, could you talk about that?
Well, I think, we have Mrs. Ramsey worrying, and especially after she feels as though Augustus Carmichael doesn't care for her. And she's both taken aback by that, and also feels as though, she feels a little as though she's being wronged. But then at the bottom of page 41, she said, she goes through and says, how can he not appreciate her? She says she had not generally had any difficulty in making people like her. For instance, George Manning, Mr. Wallace, famous as they were. And she's very aware of her beauty. She could not help knowing it. The torch of her beauty, she carried it erect into any room that she entered. And after all, veil it as she might and shrink from the monotony of bearing that imposed on her, her beauty was apparent. But then a little bit further down, she says, it injured her that he should shrink. It hurt her, and yet not cleanly, not rightly. That was what she minded, coming as it did on top of her discontent with her husband, the sense that she had now, when Mr. Carmichael shuffled past, just nodding to her question with a book beneath his arm, in his yellow slippers, that she was suspected, that all this desire of hers to give, to help, was vanity for her own self-satisfaction. Was it that she wished so instinctively to help, to give, that people might say of her, oh, Mrs. Ramsey, dear Mrs. Ramsey, of course, and need her and send for her and admire her. So, we have her doubting her authenticity, doubting even her beauty, which is very tied up for her in her sense of self. But I think we see it in other characters. I mean, I think we see it with Lily, and her painting and her, fear that maybe it is as trivial as Mrs. Ramsay believes it to be. Harriet?
Yeah, I'm still thinking about beauty. And I'm coming from thinking about a petrified man, and Welty's vision of beauty as a woman's power over the other sex. That there are different kinds of power in this book, and there's the power of Mr. Ramsay's thought and breakthrough, and there is the power of Mrs. Ramsay's beauty, but there's also a sense of powerlessness, of these things being perceived by other people. I do kind of think that although Woolf genders so much of the disputes in this book, as Welty does in Delta Wedding, there is this sense of the way that men think and the way that women think. At the same time, I think Mr. Ramsay is given the same kind of anxiety of exposure that Lily is. And I think that beauty is presented as a burden. It's a power, it's a burden. It's something that Mrs. Ramsay has to try to diminish. It is, she's perceived as high-handed because of her beauty, but there's her wrapping her beauty in an old fur coat, with both. Is that supposed to be an enhancement, or is it supposed to be that she's trying to never pay too much attention to her beauty, that she is trying to diminish it? But at any rate, I think it's I don't know that helps with Michelangelo, but I just think that beauty is a very rich topic in this book.
It's interesting that William Banks thinks she's not aware of her beauty. She has, but obviously she is very much aware of her beauty,
Yes.
and she's used it, but then she regrets using it. That's not, maybe that makes her less than authentic. So this whole question of how much aware she is of it, I think, is interesting.
And it's hard to see, she doesn't feel at moments authentic, but I don't know if that's the same thing as her being inauthentic either. I think that, and I think Mr. Ramsay seems quite different to me. I see him as questioning, I see him as questioning his abilities, that his abilities don't seem to be meeting his ambition, that those things don't seem to be matching. But even when he's thinking about that, I guess this is part of what I love about Mr. Ramsay. He sees himself, first there's the struggle to get a letter further, but then he sees himself as the leader of an expedition to a snow-capped mountain who's not going to be able to make it home alive. It's just this wonderfully kind of heroic image. So in all of his, and then he'll say and then there's a point where he says, well, it's because I'm married and I had 8 children. So I'm going to have to content myself with what I can accomplish. But I don't know that he ever, at least in the section that we've read so far, I haven't seen him really waver in his commitment to his heroicness. A moment we haven't even talked about, and I hate it because we're at 1:55 already, but there's the scene where he says, "Damn you," to Mrs. Ramsay because she dares to question his judgment. So I think that he is both, he's both caricature and so much more than caricature. Beverly.
He reminded me so much of Proof Rock. I mean, I made myself a little note in this section, the end of 45, where he walks in and teaching and preaching is beyond human power, Lily suspected, and then he wanders in to the group. He was bearing down on them. Now he stopped dead, looking in silence at the sea. Now he turned away again. And Lily's thinking when she sees him, he comes in from his books, finds them all playing games, talking nonsense, imagines what a change from the things he thinks about. And I just think of Proof Rock wandering around, you know, he's on the fringe all the time. You know, the mermaids are singing each to each, but they're not going to sing to him. And this is sort of how Mr. Ramsay is, just on the outside of the family group and of everybody else who's there. He's just sort of the modern man who maybe trying to fit in, but he's not doing a very good job of it.
Yeah, he is circling throughout. I mean, he's, you know, and when he comes in, it's, you know, he's an intruder. Tickling James on the leg, and you know, Mrs. Ramsay is thinking, "Oh, why did you have to come in right now?" So there is that sense that he doesn't belong. Ray.
Oh, thank you. I wonder if this point has been made already, but if Welty affirms two things, we don't really have to pick between them. And is it this or that? Well, it's both. And it's the same here with Virginia Woolf. And it adds to complexity. And I want to say my life is both. It's not singular. I flop here and I flop there, and I don't know what I am.
I think you're right. I mean, I think that Woolf isn't giving us a kind of a choice, you know, and that's, I was telling, well, I'm thinking so many different things. Of course, the Hogarth Press, which started in 1917, published Eliot. And so, you know, Virginia Woolf in 1927, I think, was quite familiar with Eliot's work. So, so we have that kind of interaction of that artistic community at the time. But I'm also, I was telling Suzanne at the beginning of this, before everybody got here, I had the great pleasure of seeing the stage version of Orlando, which is another interesting novel and really grows out of her relationship with Vita Sackville-West. But there's a stage version of it, and I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the actor who is playing the role of Orlando. But it is a non-binary actor who, I'll have to look up her name. But there was all of this discussion about how exciting it was that this non-binary actor was playing Orlando. And I just found myself thinking, wait a second, Orlando is anything but non-binary. I mean, you know, and I think that Virginia Woolf is in many ways binary. I mean, but I think you're right, Ray. It's not about asking us to choose, but I do think that there are ways in which Woolf represents kind of masculine energies and feminine energies as being markedly different. And I could be completely wrong about that. thank you about that note. She did do the typesetting for Wasteland.
Emma Corrin.
Emma Corrin, thank you very much.
Okay.
What year did she do that typesetting? I'm not sure. I'd have to look up those years, but anyway, I think those resonances are wonderful. So thank you all very much. I see that Jessica has her hand up and I know what that means, but I feel like, as last week, you all have really expanded my, my thinking about the novel and my thinking about so many of the different levels on which Woolf is playing and enticing us with another kind of beauty that we didn't talk about, but the beauty of the language itself here. So thank you all very much. Jessica.
I thought before we close, Melissa Fox has a beautiful, to your point, comment in the chat that I'll read just very quickly. And she was comparing about how the abstract and the concrete are layered together in this novel like brushstrokes. She's also interested in the repeating of phrases and the revisiting of images from multiple points of view so that the reader is often in the position of Lily Briscoe, working to pull together as a full and true image of this family who see themselves from different angles. So I appreciated that comment. There are too many good comments for me to mention, but we are closing out and we will see you next week as we discuss the window sections 11 through 16. Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all very much.
Thanks, Susan.